Good evening, everybody, and a very warm Inclusion Ireland welcome to everybody who's joined us this evening. We're particularly pleased to be hosting this webinar, which is a topic really dear to our hearts at Inclusion Ireland, and it's about building inclusive school cultures so that all children can have that sense of belonging. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces before we begin. This session is being recorded. And we will share the session afterwards, the recording of the session. I'm going to start with just a brief introduction about Inclusion Ireland for people who may not be familiar with us and our work. I'm then going to hand over to our guest speaker, Claire O'Neill, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. There will then be a short fireside chat at the end where I have a conversation with Claire about some of the questions that you have shared with us in advance of the webinar. And also, if you have questions throughout the webinar, you can pop them into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer some of those live as we go through the session, and we also will reserve a few of them for the end conversation with Claire as well. And we hope to address as many of the questions as you put forward this evening as we possibly can. We may need to suggest that we might follow up with you individually if there's a particular issue that you've raised this evening that we can't answer live. But we'll do our best to give you as much information as we possibly can. I'd just like to thank Team Inclusion Ireland for all the work in getting us here this evening. But I'd particularly like to thank everybody who signed up to this webinar, because I believe what that says is that there is such an interest across Ireland in developing inclusive school cultures, and that is really heartening to us at Inclusion Ireland. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all first to tell you a little bit about Inclusion Ireland before I introduce Claire. So we are the national advocacy organisation for people with an intellectual disability, and our sole purpose is to work towards the full inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities by supporting people to have their voices heard and advocating for rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So what you should expect from us as an organisation, if you engage with us, if you communicate with us, if you come to our events, we support the full inclusion of children and adults with intellectual disabilities, and we work towards fully inclusive schools, communities, and workplaces. And we want people with higher support needs who may be non-speaking to have a voice in all of our work, and we find ways to make sure that this happens. The UNCRPD and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child are at the heart of everything we do, and we build all of our campaigns and our advocacy work around human rights. We understand that as humans, we all want connection, belonging, and community in our own way, and we want to be accepted exactly as we are. And we're builders, not bashers. So our job is to point out the problems and the inequalities, and there are many of those facing children today in Ireland, as we all know. But we also focus on building better systems and supports for people. So we want to be part of the solution, and we'll work with government, state agencies, school communities, and others to make the change happen. So one of our major strands of our work is around campaigning for better supports for children and for adults. And this year we're focusing all of our efforts on building an inclusive education culture for children. And I will get a chance at the end to refer to some of the work that we've done in this space so far this year, where we've been engaging with schools and, most importantly, engaging with children and hearing about their lived experience in schools at the moment. And we know that everybody around the table with us this evening for this conversation is deeply committed to including children in schools, and that's so wonderful that we have that support across the country. And we also know we've a long way to go to make sure that children have the resources that they need to be supported in their local school. And I'll share a little bit more about our work at the end. But before I hand over to Claire, it's just the question that is on our minds and on our hearts this evening. What could be more important for any of us as human beings than belonging? And belonging in your local school is one of the most important things for children as they grow up. So I would like to now introduce you to Claire O'Neill, who's our main speaker this evening. Claire is a teacher and deputy principal based in Cork. She has over 25 years teaching experience in a wide range of settings at all levels in education. Claire is multiply neurodivergent and a parent to multiply neurodivergent children. This lived experience perspective informs her work in inclusive education. A really warm welcome to you this evening, Claire, and I'll hand over to you now.
Derval, thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome, and it's lovely seeing, you know, Inclusion Ireland's brief and just it being an organisation that I'm so happy to be collaborating with this evening. So if everyone could just bear with me while I share my screen, hopefully it won't take me too long. So here we go. So everybody should be seeing slides there, and I just appreciate a thumbs up. Yeah, I can see a thumbs up. That's brilliant. So tonight we're going to talk about creating an inclusive school culture. And I'm conscious that a lot of participants tonight will be teachers, but not necessarily everybody. So even though this is geared towards kind of education staff, I think people who are here that are not education staff will hopefully get something from the workshop tonight as well. So I at the weekend I was looking through my slide deck, and I know Derval had posted a lovely message on social media, and I was getting some nice complimentary posts on social media, and imposter syndrome really set in, and it happens me. It normally doesn't happen to me when I'm talking. However, inclusion is such a big, complex phenomenon, and people have different ideas of what inclusion should be, what it could be. It's really hard to define. So that feeling of kind of, you know, yeah, being an imposter of, or who am I to talk about such a big, important topic, definitely crept in. And like, I remembered a few things, like, you know, I kind of looked at what could we do when we're talking about inclusion. I could look at all the different definitions. I could come from the perspective of, well, what is the opposite of inclusion? And then I was thinking of all the different dimensions that we have in inclusion. And in this slide, I just have some of them mentioned. These dimensions of inclusion come from an Erasmus project that I've been involved with, All Means All. And these are the dimensions of inclusion that are being covered by that project. And then realizing that it's a 90-minute webinar, I'm not going to get the full 90 minutes either. And it's like, wow. So imposter syndrome turned into Mission Impossible. How am I going to do this? But I remember when I'm trying to do something that seems impossible, it's like eating the elephant. And don't worry, no animals were harmed here, but it is eating one bite at a time and taking it one bite at a time and remembering what I can do well. And I think what I can do well in terms of inclusion is kind of speak to the amount of hats I wear when it comes to inclusion. As Derval mentioned, I'm multiply neurodivergent myself. I'm autistic, I'm an ADHDer, and I'm dyspraxic. And that means I would have been a dyspraxic, autistic and ADHDer while I was in school in primary, post-primary, third level. So that gives me a perspective of a learner who often didn't feel like they belonged, who didn't feel like people got the way I learned or I thought about the world. I'm a teacher, so that's another hat I wear. And I have been involved in inclusive education for over 25 years now. I'm a trained primary and post-primary teacher, so I have a fairly wide view of the education system. One of my most important roles, or one of the most important hats that I wear, is that I'm a parent. I'm a parent to two wonderful children who are amazing and have high support needs. And, you know, I have a lot of experience of advocating for my children. I have experience of collaborating with wonderful education staff, and there has been challenges along the way as well. In terms of other hats, I have written on the area of inclusive education. I'm still writing in the area, and I'm researching in this area as well. So when it comes to inclusion, I do see it from a few different perspectives. And I think for a webinar of this length tonight, I think using particular lens is helpful rather than trying to attend to all these dimensions back here. If I use my lens, which would be as a neurodivergent individual, to talk about inclusion, I think that is helpful. And I will draw parallels to other dimensions of inclusion. And Inclusion Ireland are really there to advocate for people with intellectual disabilities. And in the surveys that Derval and Inclusion Ireland's team have been doing, there is a real desire from the people who responded that when we're talking about inclusion, that we do foreground neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So that is something I will be doing throughout the webinar. But I hope by using this lens, it's not that I'm kind of just speaking just to neurodivergence. I'm hoping that my lens will also draw light to all dimensions of diversity that we need to kind of attend to when we are talking about inclusive school cultures. And Derval mentioned belonging in her opening address, and this sense of belonging, we know that this is important. We know when we ask learners that, when we are talking about inclusion and feeling of inclusion, that this sense of belonging is very important. This is becoming more and more apparent in research. So I'm referring here to research by Dr. Craig Goodall, who used really novel approaches to gathering learner voice. And a really strong finding that came from Craig Goodall's research is that inclusion is a feeling. It's not necessarily that it's a place. So, questions that have already came in to us are around kind of like, schools that mightn't be resourced very well, and of course, resourcing is important, but that culture, that climate, that feeling of belonging, that feeling of being seen, that feeling of, or seeing yourself being represented is really, really important, and it's fundamental to inclusion. So tonight, we have already mentioned that there are huge barriers, there's huge pressures when it comes to forming a truly inclusive school culture and climate. And, there's a lot of kind of wider system barriers and pressures that are there. I acknowledge them. I experience them firsthand as a teacher, as a school leader, and as a parent. And tonight, like realizing that I'm taking one bite out of that elephant, I am looking at the at kind of the microsystems and the mesosystems of a school culture, and that is looking at school as a place, as a workplace, as a place of learning, and the people that are within it, that the learners, the school staff, and also the community that support the learners and the school staff. So in that, I like giving a brief overview, and I normally give the overview a bit before I'm giving it now, but I felt that kind of positionality and that kind of context was important to give first. So we have our brief introductions done. I will be focusing quite heavily on frameworks this evening, rather than focusing on definitions or on what are barriers to inclusion, what are enablers of inclusion. I will address those things, but it will be through the context of frameworks, and I'll give a rationale for that. Within that conversation, we will be looking at pertinent voices or perspectives within education as it relates to inclusion. We will look at inclusive cultures and practices and how we can facilitate these, how we can nurture more inclusive cultures and practices. And as Derval mentioned, we will be allowing time for questions and answers. So I mentioned that I'm going to be talking quite a bit about frameworks, and if I unblurred my screen here, you'd all be a bit worried about me because you'd see the mess of the room behind me, and I could describe describe the room behind me as maybe a bit of a wardrobe. I don't know if anybody else has things like that in their houses, and it's where everything is kind of everywhere and anywhere. And I'm borrowing this analogy from Andy Hargreaves. And Andy Hargreaves, when he talks about frameworks, he does describe kind of your thoughts or your ideas or your reflections moving from this messy kind of wardrobe into a nicely Marie Kondoed, color coordinated wardrobe. And I hope some of the frameworks that I share tonight will help people who are here tonight, you know, kind of think about inclusion in maybe a more ordered way, be able to communicate their thoughts about inclusion in a more systematic way. Maybe that it's something that's brought back to your school or your organization, and it's kind of like, okay, this is a framework maybe that we could use to evaluate our inclusive culture, or maybe it's a framework that you could bring back to reflect on what is already being done really well in your school or your organization. So the framework, I think any framework or any inclusive culture and climate is underpinned by values. And there's a principal here in Cork, Colin Crowley, he's the principal of the Educate Together post-primary. I've heard him talk a few times about his school. He brings every school decision back to values. And I love seeing that kind of value-based practice. And I think if you have values and use them as a North Star, it's far harder to go wrong with things. So I think when I look at frameworks, underpinning any framework has to be core values, and be they the shared values of your school or your organization, and also your personal and professional values. So the framework I'm going to be spending most time on tonight is this framework that that I had developed in looking at inclusive learning environments. So it is a framework that's kind of, you know, very much linked towards space and place and environments, but I think it's very flexible. And I hope by talking through this environment or talking through this framework that I'll share with everyone here that it isn't necessarily the framework that's important. It's kind of the process, or having kind of a commonality when there's a group of people working together towards a shared purpose. A framework can really bring collaboration and different voices together in a very systematic way. So learning is an acronym, and sometimes when I use this framework, I use it quite flexibly. Sometimes I just use the learn, and the ing is in brackets. And I'm going to just spend a bit of time bringing everyone through this now. So in the learning framework, the first thing that's there is language. And it's not necessarily that language is the most important thing when we're looking at when it comes to inclusion, but it is very important. So in the world of inclusion, in the world of disability, language can often be divided into person-first language and identity-first language. And there's a lot of difference in what people have preferences for. You know, generally people in the intellectual disability community are still using person-first language. So it'd be a person with an intellectual disability. And this is really rooted in the social model of disability. And there's a very strong rationale behind that person-first language. In contrast, within the neurodiversity community, or the community that's informed by the neurodiversity paradigm, there is a strong preference, particularly amongst adults, for identity-first language. So again, it's not everybody's choice, but as I'm speaking here tonight as a person with lived experience and being a member of that community, I do use identity-first language when I'm referring to my neurodivergence. So if I'm talking about my autism, I will say, you know, I'm Claire and I'm autistic. It's not kind of my usual conversation opener, but in spaces like this where we are talking about inclusion, it's pertinent to the conversation. So language is really important when we are looking at an inclusive culture. And out of kind of person first and identity first language, language that we use in our schools is really, really important. And something that's come up in my own research, and not just my own research, is often the kind of the talk or the chats that we have in school. Like, how inclusive are they? What do they say about our biases? What do they say about ableism? And a place in schools that often does come up is the staff room. So if you are a member of a minority, and I'll just use my own example here, if you are a neurodivergent person and somebody is saying, oh, look at the way they stack their dishwasher, that's so OCD, or that's so autistic, the way they've lined those things up. It isn't a dreadful comment, but there is ableism in it, and there is stigma in it, and it can make your place of work just feel a little bit less safe, to be in. It can be very othering, and this is something that's come up in my own research, but also in other research, particularly amongst teachers that are in minorities. I know Elaine Keane, who's done great work with Manuela Hines and Rory McDade into diversifying the teaching profession. The chat that can come up in staff rooms when it comes to other dimensions of diversity, it can be quite othering. So looking at our language and thinking, is our language helpful, and is it kind, and is it the language of inclusion, I think is really important. And I think any of these components of the framework, I could spend 90 minutes talking about each one in themselves, and I suppose that's just not possible this evening. So then environment, and environment is huge when it comes to inclusion, and environment is far more than the place, the physical environment. It can be the sensory environment, it can be the relational environment. Environment is very kind of broad and very encompassing. And there is a special journal edition coming out from LEARI, which is the Learning Environment Research journal, which is going to speak to reconceptualizing learning environments. That should be out towards the latter end of the year, and I think that will be a really interesting special edition to look at from the perspective of environment. And I know from speaking to learners who have sensory profiles that differ from what is typical, it comes up time and time again that the physical and the sensory environments of schools can be particularly harsh for people whose sensory profiles don't quite match what's considered typical. So, for example, if a learner does say to one of us, look, I can hear strange buzzing in the room, it's really affecting how I'm concentrating, and you can't hear anything, that doesn't mean that there isn't a buzzing there. We modulate our sensory input in different ways. And I think just to believe people when they talk about their experiences, and especially if the experience is a barrier to inclusion, and things like strip lighting, things like a lot of electrical equipment being on, and kind of the high-pitched sounds that can emanate from them, they can be real significant barriers within the environment. Rigid seating options, these are all barriers, and some of these barriers we can fix really easily. And then things like overcrowded classrooms are kind of barriers in the physical environment that are harder to fix. The A in the learning framework refers to agency, and this really is so important. Now, agency isn't perfectly synonymous with voice or perspective, but they're in the same family. So for learners to feel included, they need to feel like they have agency, that they have choice in their learning. So choice is something that's built in very well into universal design for learning. Agency can be built in very well, and it is generally built in very well to inclusive school cultures. So the slide here has up in the top right has a nice little decoration there, and that's kind of an aid memoir to me that when we are gathering voice from learners, or from parents, or from staff, or other stakeholders, that oftentimes, you know, it might be a survey, it might be a focus group, it's often quite verbally or text based. And that gathering of voice doesn't suit every individual. And an approach that can work really well is called the mosaic approach. So I suppose it's a research method, and it's where other means of gathering kind of data or voice are used. So that could be children using you know, creative methods like the imagined child, which is very like a roll in the wall methodology, where children are bringing in photographs, so kind of like a photo voice methodology, and maybe mapping out their school, and you know, in picture form, maybe symbolizing areas in the school where they feel included, areas where they feel excluded. This can be very helpful if you're looking at your playground and seeing what might need to be improved there from an inclusive perspective. You know, learner perspectives are really important, and so are staff perspectives, and, you know, staff feeling like they have a say in what's important in an inclusive learning culture, and parent perspectives as well. And I know Team Inclusion have engaged in research and have engaged in gathering voice and perspectives, and Derval will speak to that a bit more at the end of the webinar. But I think it is interesting to note that when parent perspectives and learner perspectives were gathered in advance of this webinar about what is important for us to share or to cover, it was very much around feelings of belonging. It was around identity. It was around authenticity, around learners feeling like they can be their authentic selves. It was around you know, like really deep complex issues like masking, like difficulties attending school, which is sometimes called school avoidance or emotionally based, or school avoidance or school refusal. You know, these were the issues that that learners and parents wanted us to share in this webinar. And it was really interesting that in what people wanted us to share, there was very little about academics, very little about academics. And there are frameworks that are coming up where I will touch on that again. So the image that should have come up here is Laura Lundy's model of participation. It's not the only model for gathering voice, but what I like about Lundy's model is that it reminds us that we need to give space and time to gathering learner voice. We need to give opportunities and multiple opportunities for learners to use their voice, but also that there's an importance for us to take action when we do gather that voice, that it's not that we just kind of gather a nice survey and have it in a folder, that we actually do take some action to operationalize what learners want from an inclusive school culture. R then is relationships. And really, I think when it comes to inclusion, relationships are just so important. They're fundamental to inclusion. And I just have a few graphics here, and here is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And like, if you look at the hierarchy, you know, we do need to make sure that children have their physiological needs met. We do need to make sure that they feel safe, you know, that they feel safe, that they have good adults taking care of them in school. And then that feeling of love or belonging, it comes up time and time again. And that comes from taking the time to form strong relationships, so that, you know, if we are trying to include people that come from backgrounds that are not what's considered typical, that are not the majority, we do need to spend a bit more time in kind of going, well, how will this learner feel included? How will they feel like, how will we help them feel like they belong here? What can we do in our culture that shows that they are part and parcel of our culture? And it's really when these parts of the pyramid are attended to that, you know, the the really important work of school, that the learning takes place, that, academic achievement can happen to the best of that learner's potential. Nell Noddings writes really nicely about ethics and ethics of care, which is so linked to belonging. Our own Kathleen Lynch here in Ireland also writes really nicely about care and care as it relates to education. I will also mention one kind of really strong relational practice that I know myself in my own practice has been so important in building inclusive cultures, and that is restorative practice. So the quadrant here is a quadrant that's used quite a lot in restorative practices. It's Van During's relationship window. And really what we want to be doing when we are building relationships with learners is building them with, so we're working with learners. So we're not providing education for learners. We're trying to provide an inclusive culture that we're co-creating with our learners. To do that, we need to give really high support, and we need to have high expectations. So it is fine to have very high expectations of our learners, but we need to match that with very, very high support. And I think that can be quite difficult to do in schools. I know firsthand it's difficult to do, especially with issues with resourcing and staffing. It can be hard to always row in with that high level of support to match the high expectations that we might have for learners. So the N in the learning framework refers to nature. Now, I could very easily have made this nurture, and I often did. I almost did, and sometimes do make it nurture if it kind of fits what I'm doing or what I'm using the framework for. However, nature is something that isn't often discussed in terms of inclusion. However, there is a real growing evidence base that nature, in terms of using the outdoors, can be hugely beneficial for all learners, and especially for some learners in kind of minority groups. So there's more and more research suggesting that being outdoors or being educated outdoors, spending time outdoors is hugely beneficial to neurodivergent learners. And I sometimes bring this back to, so the picture of the lemonade here is, in my teaching career, I've got a lot of lemons, and especially in terms of physical environment. So I am a teacher who spent most of their career in prefabs, and not kind of shiny brand new ones that have arrived in from Space Cab, but kind of really grotty, dismal ones. And that's the lemon. And then the lemonade that I've made out of that, I've been privileged enough to be in schools where I've worked with school leaders, or there has been a culture where I have been really facilitated in bringing my learners outdoors, outside to nature, and using nature to teach curriculum, but also to support regulation needs, to build relationships. Oftentimes we talk about social skills programs. It's amazing to go on a walk with a group of learners with very different needs, and how much you can facilitate different needs and also different strengths out in nature on a walk. For learners who might find eye contact too intense in a conversation, walking alongside with a peer might be just the right level of social interaction, or even walking alongside a peer who's really interested in the wildlife while you're talking about your preferred interest. There's great sociability going on there, but it's not what we consider typical say good conversation skills that stereotypically that we're taught are really important to teach, like turn taking and eye contact and all of that. It's a natural, authentic social interaction that's happening. And I'm definitely very reliant on the use of nature and outdoors in my inclusive approach to education. And for sure, sometimes when I'm using the learning framework, I will swap this out for nurture. And tonight, I just really wanted to leave in the nature aspect of it. So I'm now onto the ing part of the framework, and I have mentioned that I don't always use this. But tonight I'm going to really quickly whiz through it, and I am conscious of the time. So inclusion sometimes is swapped out for identity, but tonight I did want to leave inclusion in because, as Dervla and I mentioned at the start of the workshop tonight, inclusion is a huge, vast area. It can be really hard to define. What inclusion means may vary from context to context. I think being aware of what facilitators you have in your own context and what facilitators of inclusion that you have are really important. What barriers you have and which ones can be really easily overcome and which come and which ones can't is important. And also being conscious of the dimensions of inclusion. So I know a lot of the time when I speak about inclusion, I am speaking about neurodiversity or neurodivergent learners, but I'm very cognizant of the other dimensions of inclusion and also the intersectionality between those dimensions. N is neurodiversity informed, and this is something that came very strongly from the feedback that Inclusion Ireland gathered in advance of the workshop, that stakeholders and families that avail of the support of Inclusion Ireland, they did want information on neurodiversity in the workshop. So this is going to be the briefest whistle-stop tour ever. So I think when it comes to neurodiversity, I often operate from these 4 pillars here. And I think what's really relevant tonight are probably pillars 3 and 4. So even though I mentioned neurodiversity quite a bit this evening, there is an acknowledgement that neurodiversity operates in a very similar way to other dimensions of equality and diversity. So when I'm talking about stigma and prejudice as it relates to neurodivergence, it's a very similar experience to learners that might be in other minority groups. Pillar 4 is really positive, and I think there's great solace and great hope in Pillar 4, and it's very important when we are talking about inclusive culture and climate that there's such power and strength in diversity. So I listened to Annie Asgard, who works with IDA today, talking about celebrating diversity, and she really kind of gave me food for thought that when we are talking about celebrating diversity, it has to be so authentic that it's not that we just have, say, a neurodiversity week and job done. That when we are talking about celebrating diversity, that we really kind of interrogate, okay, like what does diversity mean for our inclusive school, and how does it enhance our experiences of being in a school, in a school culture? And that to me will be a more authentic way of celebrating diversity. Another framework that works so well for neurodiversity is Mary Doherty and colleagues' autistic space framework. We won't have time to go through it tonight, but I did want to signpost it because it is a fantastic framework. And then, yeah, I'm going to have to skip over that in interest of time. Then the G of the learning framework is goals. And I think in goals here, I'm sharing a lot more frameworks that are more school specific. So I think if you are looking at inclusive culture, and you're kind of going, well, okay, how do we see where we are and see where we want to go to? These frameworks can be really helpful in establishing that. So the maroon one here is the NCSC's really old one, well, 2011 Inclusive Education Framework. And I have to say it's one of my favorite frameworks for evaluating inclusion if you're doing a very, very deep dive. The Inspectorate's School Self-Evaluation Framework is a really useful framework for looking at inclusion. This framework here, for anybody who would have been part of Help Promoting Schools when they existed, well, they still exist, but like when the HSC ran this initiative, this framework came from there, and it's also included in the guidelines and the framework for wellbeing. these 4 areas, and looking at these 4 areas, are a great way to establish goals in developing a more inclusive culture. So culture and environment, curriculum, policy and planning, and relationship and partnerships. And then the hexagons, are they hexagons? They are. The hexagons here come from looking at our schools. So there are numerous frameworks that we can use to kind of set really strong goals in becoming a more inclusive school and culture. So just a small bit of signposting before I finish up talking, because I do want to leave enough time for questions and answers. If you are looking at trying to create a positive school culture and climate that's going to encourage inclusivity, these points are really, really helpful. These come from it's now IDA, but if you Google it through the PDSD Health and Wellbeing, these 10 points will come up. They are also in our 2013 anti-bullying guidelines, but these do give signpost us to what a positive school culture and climate might look like. And, you know, coming back to ethos and values, communication, looking at the individual. And I think this is something we do very well in Irish education, being learner-centred. I think it's something we do well. Looking at the environment, building those democratic processes, self-esteem, respect for diversity, again, coming back to language, the links between school and home and other communication or other education partners, and then that approach to assessment and building in really inclusive practices like universal design for learning into our assessment, so that everybody's experience of learning has a chance to shine, and people have a chance to show what they have learned in multiple ways. If we're looking more kind of drilling down into inclusion and maybe looking into neurodiversity, challenging ableism, celebrating difference, you know, language choices, the voices, respecting experts by experience, looking at different communication styles, and believing experiences. So not just neurodivergent experiences, but when learners are saying something is difficult or something is challenging or something makes them feel a little bit less like they belong, to listen and believe when somebody is sharing that with us. So I wish I had more time to go on and on about all things inclusion. I am conscious that I have gone through a very kind of particular lens, but I hope I've explained my rationale in the time that we have. I think picking a lens and looking at inclusion through that lens was probably the more skilled way, rather than trying to touch on every dimension of inclusion, because I know if I did that, I would probably leave some element out and maybe do a little bit more harm than good. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm going to stop sharing here now, and hopefully questions are coming in, and I'll hand over to Derval if that's okay.
Claire, thank you so much for that. It was so helpful to be brought through that framework and that lens, as you said, because I think a lot of time there's a lot of confusion about what inclusion means, what it is. And we saw a lot of those questions come in advance from school leaders, from teachers, from SNAs, from parents, you know, that confusion around what it really means to be inclusive and what it is that we're aiming for here. You know, so at Inclusion Ireland, we often talk about, you know, our role and our goal and our campaign around inclusive education is that all children should be able to belong in their local school with their siblings and their peers. And we know we're a long way off that, although we are making progress slowly but surely. And often people ask us things like, but maybe that's okay for most children, but not all children, do you know? And I think you mentioned something really that struck me earlier about, you know, having high expectations and then putting in high support. You know, that's just something that I think is really, really critical, because both of those things need to exist together. And I was absolutely heartbroken last week. I spoke to a parent who actually said that maybe I had too high expectations of my child. because I think what they had experienced with the system, trying to get into the local school, trying to apply to 30 or 40 schools, has been so difficult for that child and their family that their expectations are being reset, and that is heartbreaking, you know. So how do we keep those high expectations? I'm not expecting you, Claire, to have all the answers to this evening, but it's questions we ask. How do we keep those high expectations and also deliver on high supports for children as well, who just need it and have the right to it, you know? Um,
Yeah.
there are a couple of questions coming through the Q&A, but I just, if it's okay, I might just go back over just something that struck me about language, you know, and it was so helpful to, you know, to start by saying that really inclusive education is about a set of values, you know, and about a set of beliefs, you know, that you belong here and we're going to support you to belong here, you know, and that's your North Star. And I think that was really helpful. And to me, the language side of things, sometimes we might get a little bit of a critique at Inclusion Ireland that we get a bit hung up on language, you know, and I suppose the reason we do is because to us, language is an expression of our values. You know, so what we say or how we describe children actually is an expression of our values about what we believe about children and what we believe and what our expectations are for children. And, you know, over the last few weeks, you might have seen at Inclusion Ireland, we've been doing a lot of work. We've been communicating with schools, we've been running, you know, surveys, trying to get a gathering of the child's experience really in school today. And we were in an Oireachtas committee just 2 weeks ago looking at special education teaching and, you know, that whole debacle, and I suppose trying to advocate for children as best we could. And I was just struck afterwards by the amount of times that we all said, myself included, describing children as complex. And I just thought to myself, that is the language of the system that we're using, you know, because it's, you know, you mentioned, you know, is it kind? Is it helpful? Is it inclusive? I would say calling children complex is possibly not, you know, because it's not the child that's complex. It's the fact that we haven't figured out how to support you as the adults in the room, you know. So I'm just interested, I suppose, in what's helpful if you were to have that conversation in a staff room differently. What have you seen works in terms of maybe us all supporting each other, because we none of us get this right all the time. This isn't about getting things right or
Yeah.
wrong, it's about good intentions. Like how we can change that language and that kind of way that we talk about children. What have you seen works on a practical level, you know, in schools that helps that change of language and focus?
Yeah, I a few things, and just to say that you know, in case I have any colleagues here, generally the staff room talk in my own setting is generally quite nice, you know, we tend to have quite a nice laugh. A few things that do help is that you know, kind of having kind of ground rules. Sometimes they have to be made explicit, sometimes they don't. Our guidelines, you know, like, is it keeping it light in the staff room? You know, you know, that kind of idea of the right to disconnect, you know, and if somebody does need to talk about a child that maybe, and time is so stretched in schools, like, you know, people see you, they'll, you know, not that they'll pounce, but that's your opportunity to talk to someone. But as much as possible, kind of those kind of more kind of yeah, kind of involve conversations, but that maybe they don't happen in the staff room, you know, like confidentiality is important. So I think shared values is really important, you know. So like, I know in our school, inclusion is a shared value, care is a shared value. And it's kind of like, okay, if the conversation that's happening isn't, you know, it doesn't align with our values, then it's very easy to just kind of change tack, because we have that explicit shared understanding of those values. And something that helps us in terms of language in our school as well, in our inclusion policy, which is kind of, you know, officially it has to be called our SEN policy. It's not an acronym I really like. So in our SEN inclusion policy, we do have a guide on language. We have a guide on language, and that can be really helpful. And I have had, I have had conversations mostly with maybe outside professionals coming in, who are coming in to help and collaborate with us, and they're doing that with a heart and half. But maybe they might come in and talk about our ASD unit, and because I'm protected by policy, I can say, look, in our school we don't refer to our autism classes as ASD units. You know, we actually call all our classrooms by the names of trees, and normally it kind of diffuses the conversation, but I feel very protected by the policy, it kind of gives me not permission, but I feel safe in sharing that. And generally the conversation kind of just takes a, oh really, what names do you use or whatever. It kind of, and a lot of professionals will then kind of use the language that we prefer in our school as a result of our policy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire, for that. And I suppose another thing that struck me, and I will get into the Q&A box as well, because I can see quite a number of questions have come in. You mentioned relationship is everything, and I think we are absolutely on board with that at Inclusion Ireland. And I'm sure anybody who's joined us this evening fully understands that as well, that building that connection with the child is just the cornerstone of everything, and help, figuring out, what that kiddo needs and what accommodations they need so that they can access their right to education, it's such a cornerstone. And I suppose sometimes we see where that goes wrong, the consequences can be so devastating. Our recent survey has shown like a really significant proportion of children experiencing restraint and seclusion in school as well. And, to us, when we kind of unpick that, some of that is about just having that support and that knowledge to build a relationship with a child that might be in a different way. So for some non-speaking children with intellectual disabilities who communicate in different ways, building that relationship might look different to what is typically the case in classrooms. So I suppose I just wondered, do you want to make a comment on that, just about relationship building, when some of the typical tools that are there to build relationship might not be available and you've got to figure things out in a different way?
I think sometimes, I think shared interests are kind of using the child's interests can be such an this is where parents can really help, especially if a child, for whatever reason isn't using verbal communication as their main form of communication or using it at all. Sometimes parents will have that in. It could be a stuffed toy, it could be an interest in marine animals, and having that in and using creative approaches, like even, things like squiggle games, and blobmen cards, having ways other than kind of talk, because talk can be very confronting, language can be just too overwhelming. Again, I do rely quite a lot on the outdoors and nature. I think it diffuses kind of the high pressure of a kind of a face-to-face kind of interaction. And also the environment is really important. So in my room in school, I have bean bags, I've cushions, I've cuddly toys, so it doesn't look like a typical classroom. It probably doesn't look as cozy as I'd like, but I think that kind of cozier environment does help build relationships. But a child knows if you're interested, and a child knows if you want to make the effort, and just persevering with it. If your usual tact doesn't work, just trying different approaches. Or sometimes if a child is some way up the school, asking a colleague, who has a good relationship with the child, look, what has worked for you, and maybe trying that. But I think just kind of going the distance and persevering with it is really important.
Yeah. And I think that's, it struck me what you said earlier about, believing people when they tell you, something, just because, maybe 80% of children in the class don't find the buzzing light a difficulty, there's going to be 20% of kids who do. And then, how a child communicates that might be very different. So some
Yeah.
kids will tell you directly that light is really bugging me.
Yeah.
And other kids will show it by wriggling in their seat or by, just expressing it in a different way. So really it's about tuning into that as well, isn't it, Claire? And just figuring that out. How is
Yeah, and
this?
just being very curious about that, and figuring it out. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I suppose just a couple of comments that have come through first before I get into questions. So, and thanks to everybody who's popped into the Q&A. So I'm just seeing an excellent overview of inclusion and culture. Thank you for progressing the conversation with us all this evening. It's fair to say that if we were asked in a school who here is responsible for inclusion, the answer can't be the Senko or the principal, rather the answer must be we all are,
Yeah,
and that's a challenge, isn't it, in
yeah,
schools, to make
it
inclusion
is. Yeah.
everybody's business. Yeah, yeah. Um, so one direct question is, would you recommend a school has an inclusion policy, or is that an oxymoron? So you spoke about earlier
Mhm.
just that you've got nice policies around language, and this is how we do
Yeah.
things around here, this is how we talk about kids here. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on the
I
inclusion?
I don't think everything has to be kind of enshrined in a policy. I wouldn't be against one. And I mean, like I just mentioned that our school has, our SEN policies are SEN and inclusion. However, I think what's probably more important is that shared value and a shared understanding of inclusion. And that there's a real reason why I didn't go into definitions of inclusion tonight, because like there will be certain commonalities between everybody's idea of inclusion, but it will take on a different flavor or a different spice in different schools. So my cousin, who's also a teacher, 80% of the learners in her school are EAL pupils, which is a very different profile to my school. So inclusion will look a bit different there. So that's why I would kind of say, like, really as a staff, and I know time is so limited, or as a community, try and come together and really spend time on what is inclusion for us, and also realizing that that has to be kind of a living or a working kind of, rather than a strict definition, kind of a living, working kind of idea or vision of what inclusion is, because school communities do change, so I'm not against policy, but I think there's groundwork that needs to be done before a policy. And of course, so many of our policies anyway do support inclusion, like our SEM policies, our anti-bullying policies, acceptable use. So
Yeah.
so many of our policies do already support inclusion.
And it strikes me what you're alluding to there again is just maybe maybe policies are useful, and maybe that's something that can be explored. But again,
Yeah,
isn't it a kind of a set of values around
yeah,
inclusion? What are our values as a school? What are we going
yeah,
to do to support children to feel they belong? Might be a
yeah.
helpful starting point. Whether you
I
end up
think
with
so.
policy is
Yeah,
another thing,
yeah.
but that grounding is really critical.
That's it. And I think if it is kind of being put into a document or writing, those frameworks under the goals are a really good place to start. And they could be the formation of a policy. But I think, I think it's something that needs to be teased out and, interrogated, and considered collaboratively first before kind of put into a policy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. So just another couple of comments and then I'll take another couple of questions. So the learning acronym is really helpful and succeeds in making inclusion a more understandable concept. So that's great. And we love a framework at Inclusion Ireland, and we're delighted to see, that's something that's useful to people who've attended this evening. I suppose I have a couple of questions about kind of new, like teachers or educators who are kind of new to, maybe it's a new special class, or they're supporting kids with intellectual disabilities or the neurodivergent kids. Um, how can I promote inclusivity and cater for learning needs? So that's a broad question, but just as somebody starting out, what's a good place
Yeah.
to start?
Yeah, and I do really acknowledge my privilege in this, that I am a school leader and I have quite a bit of agency in how I would like things to go in my school. And starting out, you don't have that same kind of, I suppose, professional capital, for want of a better way of putting it. What you do have though is, like, somebody having the desire to kind of promote inclusivity in a school is fabulous. So I think it's seeing what you can influence, and having those small wins. So like within your own classroom, celebrating success, and sharing kind of good inclusive practice. And if you have leadership that are supportive of inclusion, if you have ideas, going to them. I think sometimes going with ideas rather than problems is often a really, really good thing. So for example, one thing that we've tried in our school in the last few years is we've introduced the LEANS curriculum, which is a curriculum to teach all children about neurodiversity. And that is something that has enhanced our inclusive culture. But that's something that anybody at any stage of their teaching career could implement in a school. So it's your kind of your sphere of influence and knowing what you can influence. And I think your classroom is a really good place to start.
Thank you, Claire, for that. Just to highlight to everybody, I believe when the survey link was put in first, there was an issue with it. It's back up and running. I think a lot of people have answered already. It would be really useful while we have people with us this evening to complete the survey. It gives us more information and it will help us to stay connected with you as well for future webinars and supports from Inclusion Ireland. Just to say, you know, so far looking at some of the responses that have come in, one of the questions was, you know, in your opinion, is there a belief within schools that some children do not belong in a mainstream school? And 90% of respondents agreed with that statement. So, you know, it's just to highlight, I suppose there's a road to travel. And I know we're here amongst friends this evening who really want to see inclusion happen, and everybody is participating with us this evening. So again, it's just highlighting that that belief, those values aren't embedded fully yet across our communities, and we've a road to go to make sure that that happens. So just another kind of direct question here coming in through the Q&A about friendship, you know, and I think that's just so important. And a person, a participant is saying about a junior infant child, and she feels that she's having difficulty connecting with her peers, and she doesn't feel that she has friends at the moment, you know. So just on a practical level in that situation where you're really supporting, you know, people to form relationships and kids to feel happy and belonging in school, you know, any practical suggestions or things that you feel in a general way
Yeah.
could support friendship
Yeah.
making?
Yeah, and I think this is something, I think it's something we see in every infant class, and I think it's something we're seeing a lot more in the younger classes. And look, I don't know. I mean, I think the folk knowledge are kind of on the ground. We feel that this might be kind of one of the more the sadder kind of after effects of the global pandemic. And sometimes children will struggle with forming friendships, you know, regardless of, you know, global pandemics or what have you. So I think for a child who is finding it difficult to form friendships, I would be very curious about that child and how content they are, because oftentimes children, it's so overwhelming starting into a new environment and starting into a new, you know, new school, new ways of learning, that oftentimes all their energy is being expended on kind of, you know, not surviving school, but kind of doing school. And like the friendships are kind of maybe something that the child just hasn't got the energy for, or, you know, but they might be quite content in that they might be getting their kind of their social interaction enough through group work, through Ashter. And it might be that they just at maybe at break time just don't want to kind of have more kind of social play. They might prefer imaginary solitary play. And so I think kind of first of all, not to make too many assumptions, that like it, to be open to the possibility that a child might be content not to be as social as we might typically expect. That's one thing. And then I suppose if somebody's asking this question, I am going to assume that maybe the child, you know, is maybe a bit lost, maybe is finding it hard to make those connections with children. I think their context and background can be very helpful. Is this an only child? Is this a child whose siblings are a lot older? Is this a child that's used to kind of very rough and tumble interaction with their sibling, and that might work at home, but it's not working in the school context? So sometimes play and friendships need to be scaffolded really, really carefully. And it's just kind of, you know, really observing and seeing, okay, are there barriers to this child forming friendship? Oftentimes that can be a language barrier. So kind of looking at being really curious about what the barriers are and seeing what barriers are easily broken down. So for a lot of children where language might be a barrier, whether they are nonverbal at present, or, you know, they might be situationally mute, or there might be English might be an additional language. Sometimes taking the language out of some play experiences and, you know, using action games, using very simple turn taking games might be an in. Again, going back to the chestnut of shared interests, what is that child really interested in? What makes that child's world come alive? Are there children in the room that have shared interests? And that can be a really nice way to encourage friendships. It might be where the child is developmentally as well. That, oftentimes in infants, children can still be at that parallel stage of play, and it is appropriate to be at that parallel stage of play. So it may be that just developmentally that child isn't quite ready to form kind of, real strong social friendships, and the parallel play opportunities might be very important for that child. Some children, and I think this is COVID again, they just might not know how to play. I'm kind of slow to mention screen time, but a lot of children are very reliant on screens for their leisure time at home, and they just may not have had experience of play in the senses that we're kind of used to seeing in school. So it might be even teaching a few playground games, like duck duck goose, like tig, like den, and just seeing if that will encourage the child's friendships. So I suppose there isn't any one suggestion, but hopefully in those suggestions that there might be something that kind of makes sense for that child. And I think for that child, even if they don't have a lot of friendship experiences in the junior end of the school, that can of course change, but teachers and staff modeling respectful, kind, warm relationships is so important. So if you are lucky enough to have an SNA in your room for part of the day, that you're really modeling warm relationships, that you're modeling respectful language. And this is something that teachers do so well, that if somebody does bring in something, that there is a thank you, and there is a you're modeling empathy, you're modeling giving comfort. I think all of that is really important.
Wonderful. So I suppose the nugget there for the person who asked the question is just starting with curiosity, and it might be one of those things might be what's happening
Yeah.
with the child, and it's about staying curious and figuring it out with the child. Yeah, great. Thank you, Claire, for that. So just I suppose a few things have come up about language as well. So I might kind of morph a few of these questions together. And a bit of like, I suppose what I'm getting a sense from a couple of questions is that a lot of schools are giving names to autism classes, like the sunflower room, etc. And there was another question focused on, we want to have a celebration of neurodivergent children, but there's a bit of a reluctance because we're almost afraid of naming that children are neurodivergent or are autistic. And there's kind of a dance that we all do around labels and identity and kind of maybe wanting to be respectful, but maybe shying away from this is the child's identity, this is who they are, and wanting to be respectful of parent choice within that, and also wanting to celebrate diversity. So that complexity, I'm just interested in how schools can approach that in a way that's respectful of everybody's opinions and yet celebrate the wonderful diversity that our communities have.
Yeah, and that is a real tricky one, and it is a real complex one. And again, I'm kind of acknowledging a type of privilege here in that, my lived experience kind of does give me a bit of, I suppose, license to kind of really set my stall out with language, and I realize that. And I think language specifically as it relates to our autism classes, I think knowing where you are, and I don't want to get too deep, but kind of knowing where you are philosophically when it comes to autism is really important. And I know, like, say, in my own setting, we are very informed by the neurodiversity paradigm, and the neurodiversity paradigm really does give us a very strong language to use around, and rationale for using that language around autism. So I think that that autism within the neurodiversity paradigm is kind of expressed as an identity. It's kind of a neutral fact of nature that neurodiversity exists. So for me to call myself autistic is it's not an insult, it's just a fact of fact of life, the same way I could say I'm a brunette,
Mhm.
especially if the dye bottle has been out, you know. It's just a fact about me, you know. It's not a superpower. It's not I don't see it as a negative either, but I just see it as a neutral fact about myself. So the neurodiversity paradigm really helps me with language. I think then the neurodiversity paradigm is a counterpoint, or is a foil to the medical model, or the more accurately the pathologizing model. So that's why, when people are kind of, and a lot of people will still call ASD classes or ASD units, but in that it's autism spectrum disorder, which is a very medicalized or pathologizing term. And unit, when you think about it, it's something very separate. There's something very segregational about the word unit. It's something that I definitely associate with a hospital, the radiography unit, the colonoscopy unit, whatever it might be. So it's kind of knowing why you're making the language choices. And that's kind of your philosophical underpinning, which is the neurodiversity paradigm. I think it's really important to honor people's preferences, though, and I'm very aware that not everybody will have a preference for identity first. So if you're not sure, ask. I do think it's helpful for schools to have a stance on this, and even if it's a flexible stance, I do think it's helpful. I'm not a fan of documents that kind of interchange the language choices. I'm not a big fan of them, and that's my opinion rather than, because I think you kind of need to know what a school stands for, and a school that is very neurodiversity affirmative, or neuro affirmative, they're not going to kind of prevaricate between the two. They are going to use identity first. I think with autism classes being called names, I'm a fan of that. That's what we do in our school. However, what I wouldn't be a fan of is, say, in a school where classes might be 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and they're the mainstream classes. And then you go down to the hub, or you go down to the sunflower room, or you go down to the rainbow room. Because that's, again, I think, exclusionary in a way. I'd try and use principles of universal design, and what you're using for your specialized classes, I would also use for your mainstream classes, because it does create a sense of cohesion. But I think acknowledging that language can be complex, and that we will get language wrong. I get language wrong, and I think it's asking, the same way if you're not sure of somebody's pronouns, it is okay to ask, it is okay to ask. And it shows a curiosity, it shows a curiosity, and it shows a willingness to learn. I hope that answers that question. Okay.
Thank you, Claire. Absolutely. We've another, I suppose it's a comment or a question directed at
Mm.
Inclusion Ireland. How well does the Department of Education or the National Council for Special Education listen to Inclusion Ireland? A lot of terms that aren't acceptable to those who are neurodiverse, neurodivergent, are still all in the departmental documents and circulars, etc. And I wholeheartedly agree with the person who asked this question. Some of the language is so entrenched, it's in our legislation, the education for persons with special education needs. Our legislation is rife with that kind of language. The National Council for Special Education itself is not called the National Council for Inclusive Education. So it absolutely permeates. And we have been working a lot on this year, as people are very familiar around with us this evening. The EPSAN Act is being reviewed this year, and as part of our submission, we asked for it to be changed to the Inclusive Education Act, and again, set a tone, in our policy and our legislation, that we are about inclusion and belonging. So again, we have a road to go there, and I suppose we're taking every avenue at Inclusion Ireland of trying to influence that language and that change from the top right the way down. Yeah, so thank you. There's just one or two other questions, Claire, and then we will leave you in peace for the evening. And thank you so much for being generous with your time and your expertise. So just one clarification is, can you please repeat the course you have implemented in your school, Claire?
Oh, yeah. So that's lean, so like lean cuisine, for those of us old enough to remember those things. So LEANS. So that's learning about neurodiversity in school. If you Google it, it'll come up fairly quickly. If you Google it with University of Edinburgh, you probably get it a bit quicker, but it's a free curriculum. It's completely free, no training required. You know, you would check if your school is kind of in a state of readiness for it in terms of inclusivity, but there's tools on the website that will help you do that. I have taught it twice now myself. I taught it in my daughter's classroom, and you know, to say that it was transformative, particularly for that first group, that I thought wouldn't be an understatement. And I'm not, don't tend to be dramatic about things, but in terms of children understanding really difficult concepts that are inclusion related, like the difference between you know, equality and equity, understanding that fair is everybody getting what they need, not everybody necessarily getting the same thing, and the difference between needs versus wants. So, you know, some of us will need things in education, and some of us will want things, you know, and it's okay to want things, but you know, sometimes when there's a real genuine need there, that we'll have to trump the want sometimes. So yeah, so that curriculum, I would highly recommend it. The one of the lead researchers, Alyssa Alcorn, who developed Leans, also developed lovely resources around belonging. So if you Google belonging and Cambridge, her resources on kind of you know, amplifying a sense of belonging will come up fairly readily, and I'm really happy to recommend that curriculum.
Thank you. And a follow-up question to that was, is the Leans program suitable for post-primary?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I know the research team had wanted to kind of expand it out to post-primary, and you know, I'm not quite sure, but anyway, there wasn't funding for that to happen. What I will say is kind of knowing your cohort, knowing your group, I would think that yeah, I would think it could be, with a small bit of adaptation, be used with first years and possibly second years. And beyond that, it's story based. Beyond that, the story and the graphics might just, you know, the kind of, it wouldn't be with it enough. You know, I know it is very with it, but you know, for knowing kind of older adolescents, yeah, you might kind of lose the messaging in it. However, there are really interesting research kind of developments happening with other supports, like peer support, like neurodivergent peer support within post-primary. And if I hear of any of that being published or being developed, or I'll share that with you, you know, in case anybody in the Inclusion Ireland family would be interested in that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. Just a quick reminder again for anyone who hasn't completed the survey, if they could just take the last couple of minutes to do that. Again, you know, this is part of an ongoing conversation we are going to have at Inclusion Ireland with leaders in education, with our community, about how we can move forward and develop inclusive school communities for all children. So really, the more that engagement that we have with our participants and people who showed up tonight, the more we can design webinars, information sessions for you that will support you as you support children to belong in their local schools. There's just a question here about time. And, you know, I think it's important to address that, you know.
Yeah.
So one of the key challenges to developing relationships in a mainstream class is time.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
your perspective on that?
Well, I completely agree. And I think time is certainly our enemy. I know it's my enemy. I'd never have enough of it. You know, I have one third class boy who's working on making me a cloning machine, and I can't wait until that happens, you know. So yeah, time definitely. And what I would say is, and I have taught in a mainstream classroom for years as well, I think you're on a hiding to nothing if you don't put in the time as well. And I know all the pressures that are on our time. And I know there have been classes where it's taken me longer to kind of build that really strong rapport and sense of community in the classroom. I can remember one year having a class, and they were fabulous class, but it was coming up to the October midterm break, and I wasn't plowing through the curriculum because it was still, like, you know, building up you know, practices around group work, around expectations, you know, and however, I know if I hadn't put in that time, the rest of the year just wouldn't have run as nicely as it ended up running. So I completely acknowledge that time is, it's so precious, it's so limited, and and especially with our class sizes the way they are, it's so hard to give each child even a minute or two of individual time. I know things that have helped me with that, and I'm sure people are doing this a lot anyway, but it's having regular circle time in classrooms in the morning, making sure that I'm in a space to greet children when they come in, because oftentimes you're trying to get all your busy work done before they come in, but greeting them and greeting them by their name, trying to remember little bits and pieces that they've told you in their news, like, oh, how's Daisy, the new puppy, doing, or, how's mom doing in her new job, and just they're the little things that create sense of belonging. I can still remember little comments like that from my primary school days back in the dark ages. A teacher just kind of going, "Oh, Claire, I know you love reading. Have you read this yet?" And it's just, it only took seconds, but like, and I don't think that teacher would have put a whole lot more effort into building a relationship with me, but I remember just being so seen, and so, yeah, that sense of belonging, so it can take a lot of time with some children, but often children that take that extra bit of time are the children that really, really, really need you to connect with them. I think people who are here tonight know that. I'm not saying it's not easy, but I suppose it'd be wrong of me not to say I absolutely believe in the importance of spending that time in developing those relationships.
Wonderful. And I think that's a message to maybe finish up with this evening is
Yeah,
that piece around those small moments for children just mean absolutely everything in terms of feeling connected with, belonging, being seen, being valued, being respected, being heard,
yeah,
and I really understand the person who asked the question, looking at
yeah,
time. Things are so
yeah,
constrained and there's so much going on. And we hear that from schools all the time, our last surveys and dealing with
yeah,
some of the principals forums, and that they really told us that there is that disconnect between what's being said at a policy level and sometimes what's happening on the ground in schools, and all the challenges. And
mhm,
however, it's really important to bring it back to that, isn't it? That those small moments actually mean the absolute world, and people carry those moments with them forever, feeling connected and seen and heard and belonging. So thanks, Claire, for finishing the Q&A on that note. We really appreciate your time this evening. It's been invaluable, insightful. I think we need more of these open conversations together. Where we explore the really complex and deep issues about inclusion and belonging and what it means for each of us as individual humans. As I said at the beginning of the seminar this evening, what could be more important than belonging? For every child to feel that they belong in their local school and to have the support of the school community, there is nothing more important. So we'll continue to have these conversations together. We're going to continue at Inclusion Ireland to support our school communities, to support children to belong. And that's where we're going to invest a lot of our resources this year, because we think that's what is so important for children. And we look forward to seeing people who've joined us this evening at our next webinars. We are going to be running a series between now and the summer, so please stay in touch with us on social media. Many of you will have answered the survey and have possibly agreed to stay in touch with us in between webinars, and we'll let you know what's coming up next and how you can support our work and how we can support your work, because I think together we're stronger, and we can make the changes that are so necessary for our wonderful children with intellectual disabilities to belong exactly as they are and exactly who they are. So thanks everyone this evening for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. If you'd like to become a member of Inclusion Ireland, please just click into our website, inclusionireland.ie. You can become a member as a supporter and an ally of people with intellectual disabilities, and we'd really welcome you joining us in our movement for change together. Thank you all. Good night.